also a social entity, that you live and breathe with the changes of the society, and you reform your practices according to the changes of society. That's why practices that happened 2 millennia ago are not happening anymore. Men and women don't no longer have to sit in separate seats when it comes to practicing religion. Men and women don't not necessarily have to not talk anymore regarding religion. Men are no longer superior in terms of religious context compared to women. We do believe that these reformations are changing, but yet the dogma doesn't change, that God loves you, that you're a son or a daughter within your deity. And within the boundaries of religion, we're telling you that you having a more moderate tone is actually a much preferable or much desirable way to design our society. As Deputy Prime Minister, I'm going to prove to you how we can actually change the culture of negativity that exists in the status quo, how we can positively change that and change the perception to a more acceptable, preferable manner. For that, couple of responses. Number one, they tell you that trend is artificial and you're reactive because people hate you to be a religious group, so it's like a scapegoat, like an excuse that you use. I'm a moderate. Number one, we told you already that reformations are actively happening because Christians were blamed to be discriminatory towards the LGBT community, towards women, and against the movement of feminism or gender equality or sexual equality in general. That's the reason why we actually see active changes of moderates, exactly like the Pope saying that LGBT people are also part of our community that we need to embrace. We also saw positive changes. For example, when it comes to like IS-tearing people, we saw Protestants bandwagoning and protecting Muslims for their own area to pray. We think that this kind of like cohesion or embracement culture that we're seeing is exactly the definition of moderation. Thank you. We think when it comes to other people willing to let go of their extreme values and extreme practices, to be precise, we think that that's the reason why we're seeing a change. We don't think it's just a scapegoat or an excuse that you try to use, but it's actually happening in the status quo, where people are changing their mindsets because of the narrative that you see out in the media of how your religious leaders are actually persuading you to no longer be stuck up with the dogmatism or the practices that happened 2,000 years ago. But now, since we're living in the 21st century, this is a narrative that we're supporting. We do believe that it's actual, it's not reactive, it's actually proactive in terms of making a change in the society. Thank you. When they talk about how conservatives are now forced to change the values, number one, we do believe that conservatism needs to change. In other words, if conservatism includes values that are harmful to the society, like reproof, for example, you very conservatively and word to word trying to analyze your Bible or the Quran, saying that, oh, on this very verse, there's something bad about women, so you deserve to burn in hell, we do believe that that's conservative, that sense of conservative interpretation needs to change. We do need to have a more moderate, more flexible, reflective idea or analyzation, or like when it comes to interpretations of the Holy Scripture. Sit down, sir. We do believe that those things are necessary to change, and we do believe that moderates are doing exactly that. POIs. Yes.
Okay, like if you go to France, they call the Muslim woman who wears the burqa in the public place as extremist, right? And are you willing to hate those people?
The reason why those things are now in a dichotomy, according to closing opposition, is because there is no dialogue created by the moderates and the conservatives. We do believe that in the status quo, the moderates are the one who is fostering conversation. The moderates are the one willing to engage whether or not wearing and covering up your skin is a right way to practice your own religious dogma. We do believe when it comes to conservatisms, only one way criticism happens, that you're wrong, you're not a good believer, and this is the good believer that we want to create. We do believe that this segregation is only happening on their side of the house. Moderates are actually pursuing the idea of more inclusion, more values, more colors to be included within the boundaries of religion. Let's go on to how we're going to create a positive culture. It's a twofold. Firstly, we think that it works for a tool for persuasion among religious people. In other words, we do believe that now it's strong enough to create a social force or a drive towards changing understanding within Christian groups or within Muslim groups. When we're seeing that my fellow Christian, under the values of extremism or under the values of very extreme conservatism, is actually committing a crime or a harm, I, as an active Christian, can say, no, I'm a moderate, please stop doing that because you're giving my religion a bad name. We do believe that this active sense of change in mind and perception is only happening within the religious groups. We do believe that this is a method of bridging the gap between radicalization. It also creates a culture of criticism. We do believe when the criticism only came from external forces, for example, non-believers, or Muslims criticizing Christians, Buddhists criticizing Christians, now this culture within Christians is happening. Now Christians themselves, who identify themselves to be moderates, are saying, please don't do that because I don't believe in what you believe in. My God is a God of love. My God is a God of embracement. My God is a God of acceptance, Mr. Speaker. But moreover, on a second level of analysis, we do believe, even outside of religious context, change is happening. We do believe when religious community in general had the name of being a stuck-up dogmatization group, we do believe that now these moderates are actively being able to promote and positively portray the values of religious dogmatism. We do believe that this dialogue of embracement, for example, scientist community just blatantly saying that all religious people are stupid, they're irrational, they believe in a deity that doesn't exist. We do believe that the sense of radicalization, elimination, is actually leading for people to be more persuaded by the benefits that religious entities are providing. Of course, on a fundamental level, when it comes to the first characterization of dogma, maybe those things cannot be compromised. But when it comes to Christian charities, Muslim charities, actually actively giving that, now those efforts are recognized in the society because there's no longer hatred towards religion. No longer you disagree on the practices that LGBTs burn in hell, or women are inferior compared to men. We do believe that this positive change of culture is only activated with the existence and the predominance of the rise of moderates, and it's only happening under our model, Mr. Speaker. What do we believe in? We believe in a world where people, whatever form of deity they believe in, they can still be accepted in society, they can still self-actualize themselves as an individual, but also as a social being, as a social entity. Churches, mosques, or whatnot can also function in a positive manner in terms of making positive change in society. For all these reasons, opening door for this project.
Alright, we'd like to thank the previous speaker for his remarks. To close the opening half, we'd like to call upon the Deputy KIDA.
A Muslim woman in a burkini was criticized because of the fact that it made other people discomfortable and into the fact that it seemed as an extremist. We think the idea of yourself identifying yourself as moderate is not only at the end of that, it makes rather a social norm, and it makes the world into a dichotomy. If you're not a moderate, you're rather an extremist. We want to oppose that idea, and we think rather we should go away with that. Before I move on to my own argument, why I want to explain why extremists actually become even more extreme onto their paradigm and becomes much more of a harm of what the harm that already exists that moves on to the rebels. First, for rebel to Hyewon, onto the idea that religion function is now becoming more productive because it presses the idea that you're more important, you should share love, and gains more support. First of all, we don't necessarily see how the principle and the function becomes better just because you gain more support. Rather, the religious value could be itself independent, and when you have your own religious belief strong enough, it could be aside from that. So we don't necessarily see why we need to have support from other selves. But we could see also rather it could be against it, because it could also be viewed into the perspective of the ideology being weakened, which is why my leader of opposition explained to the idea of why we thought this was rather of a reactive idea. To religion now, it was becoming a reaction towards a social progressiveness that other people wanted us to change, and other people thought we needed to accept other ideas that we necessarily couldn't or did not want to, which is why we think it's not principally right. Onto the idea of what they also said is that it's going to allow gays to include themselves into religion. It's now going to become inclusive. Onto the ideas of what we think are basically two levels. Number one, if you're gay and you want to believe in religion, that's your own right, and we don't necessarily see why yourself, identifying yourself as a moderate, is necessary. But more importantly, and to the ideas of what they said, that you have conflicting two ideas and how you're going to do about that, we're not sure if how that is any more mutually exclusive to other ideas. You could be a conservative, but also like certain ideas of a liberal politics. And to the idea that it's not mutually exclusive to the status quo of any other ideologies, which is why why we don't see that is any more of a bad notion. But we think that is actually a good thing. Why? Because if you have conflicting ideas, this is the reason of how ideas from both sides can develop. Onto a conflict, it leads on to more ideas that could conflict against it, and it develops throughout the conflict between themselves, which is why we think that it is actually a beneficial notion. So let's move on to a few more reasons of what they say. We think rather the idea of religion is also subjective to time, and it's also dilutive in time naturally. And to the sense that Pope also allows more openness is unnecessary. Therefore, for a moderate to be identified by an individual, we don't necessarily see how that's supposed to be. Rather, we think their status quo is now pushing and shortening the time of how you're going to change religion in general of a perspective, and it's rather cornering people who wanted to be a strong believer into an extremist that you should not believe into that extent, and you should become a moderate. We think, however, we think now conservatives should become more of a subjective idea, because in France and because in other countries that are circular, and to the extent you just being a strong believer, you just having a burqa or a hijab could be now seen as an extremist, and we think that's supposed to be bad.
Sir, the very reason that the isolated community are being able to be included in the church community is because of the rise of moderates. They're the one who created a safe haven within church that marginalized communities can now enter. Why do you deny that?
We think we think into the instance of why we already explained to you why that's not mutually exclusive, that it could be also possible. But more importantly, if you're now going to corner other people who are not moderates, who are just strong believers, who are not extremists, all characterized into a box that is now onto the idea of extremists, we think that's rather much more of a harm. Finally, of their idea that it's now giving a bad name to religion, as we consistently said, it's now becoming a social progression of you trying to put people into a singular idea, which is why we think it's bad. And just because you're not a moderate should not mean that you're an extremist, and we think therefore that's a bad social notion. But let's try to talk about a bit more harms of what they said. Because their harms in the status quo is having more people going against gays publicly. Their harms in the status quo is having people bombing themselves up and being terrorists and becoming more and more extreme. We think under the status quo's notion of having more and more people actively identifying themselves as moderates actually make this problem much more harmful. Why is that so? We basically think there are two notions that could possibly influence religion. As number one, trying to embrace and have more followers of your religion, or number two, losing your followers that you consistently already have. Onto the sense that trying to embrace more followers is a benefit, therefore not having that is not necessarily a threat. But the problem is, more and more of you losing the followers that you consistently already had is now going to become a threat to the religion. And to another sense, having more and more moderates onto a strong believer's perspective or extremist perspective is having more and more people having less belief towards your religion and having less loyalty to the ideology. And to a sense, now it's going to be a threat towards that ideology, and it also becomes a threat to the sustainability towards that religion in the perspectives of extremists. And to the idea, therefore, we think it's actually going to make extremists even more extremist. Extremists now need to be strong. Extremists now need to react in order to make their religion, their ideology sustain. And in order for you to maintain, you need to become more reactive towards the society. You now need to make suicidal bombs towards the liberals, towards the westernized culture in order to sustain Muslims, and in order for you to now have your own ideology and your sustainability granted, you now need to become strong. We think their harms in the status quo is actually going to be even more stronger and harmful, and to the sense having actively identifying individuals in the form of moderates. In that sense, we would rather regret that status quo and not welcome it. And we want people to not be cornered just because you're not in moderates. You can become a strong believer, and you could say you should be able to fulfill and perform and practice your religion in your own way as you want. We're proud to oppose.
Thank the previous speaker for his comments. We will begin the closing half of this debate. All of our members.
the opening government stood for two groups of people in this debate. First, they stood for the victims of religion, talking about how the marginalized are now able to enter this religion. We agree that's a good thing. They also talked about the believers of religion, those that were moderate and self-actualize better on their side of the house. Unfortunately, I think in both of those camps, there are more important stakeholders. I'm going to prove to you two things. First, how the conservatives are going to be better off in a world where the conservatives and like people who actually believe this religion are going to be better off on our side of the house. And secondly, the secular will be better off on our side of the house. Those who are actually seriously victimized in this sense. Everything will be integrated. And first, I'd like to start with the conservatives, that if you are a woman who wants to wear a burqa, if you are a woman, for example, the people who are shamed by wearing a burkini in the beaches of France, that you are better off on our side of the house. Let's start. Firstly, it is easier to be a conservative in our side of the house because you provide a critical mass of individuals that are moderate. Importantly, let's try to disaggregate the characterization that's coming from that side of the house. They seem to say that if you are a moderate, you are going to criticize those who are going to wear burqas. The crucial distinction there is that they're talking about liberals, not moderates. The very idea that you are a moderate Muslim means that you are open to other interpretations of that same faith. What that means is that even though I am like a very devout Muslim, I can best understand those who choose not to be a proper Muslim, but also those who choose to be a proper Muslim, because I am open to the possibilities of those ideas. Saying that those people increasing overall in society is better for those who choose to hold conservative practices, because that critical mass will oftentimes stand for their ideas. So if in France we see that those people being criticized for wearing burkinis in beaches, there will be moderate Muslims standing for their rights and saying, you know what, that is a perfectly acceptable choice, because on the comparative, when it isn't the case, more stigma exists. The way you have to conceptualize this overall religion working is to analogize it to Judaism. That is to say, there are people who are really, really devout, but those people are better off on our side of the house because there are still continuous sources of funding given to them. You can be a very devout Jew in the United States of America, despite there being a lot of very liberal, a lot of very moderate Jews, because there's first coherence in each group so that you can pick and choose what you want, but secondly, insofar as the interests are clearly